Asatoma sadgamaya, tamasoma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritangamaya. Om. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. Good morning. Today's topic is a journey like no other. When we think of a journey, perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is physical travel, going from one place to another here in this world. That is definitely one meaning of the word journey. But we can also think of journey in a metaphorical or a symbolic sense. We can say, for example, that a particular series of events that we have experienced, either outwardly or inwardly, made for a journey, quite a journey. And in a more general sense even, we can say that any human life is a journey. There is a physical aspect to it. We all begin life as newborns. We become infants, toddlers, children, teenagers, young adults, middle-aged, and eventually we reach old age. So in that sense, we can say that life is a journey through time. Life can also be a journey through places. Some people are born into a family that has deep roots, it doesn't move around. Somebody else might be born to a family that moves frequently. So there are these different ranges of experiences. And then there are the activities of life. We may leave home to go to college, to pursue a career, to get married, to start a family of our own. And over and above that, every individual has unique experiences. So we can really say that every journey is unique. There are no two identical lives. So that's pretty much what we're thinking about in terms of journey when we speak regularly. So what is this journey like no other? That is the spiritual journey. And we'll begin with two parallels to the geographical journey. The first one is you can only start from where you are. If you're in Los Angeles and you want to make a trip from Los Angeles to New York, you start in Los Angeles. You can't start that trip in Chicago. Also, there are different ways or modes of travel, different ways to get from one place to another. So again, let's say our destination is New York. From Los Angeles, maybe we'll fly in a plane. From Chicago, maybe we'll take a train to New York. From Miami, maybe we'll drive up in our car. And if we're in London and we want to go to New York, there's the possibility of sailing across the Atlantic in a ship. Each one of these journeys is very different. It takes a different amount of time. It uses different methods to get there. The experiences, the duration, the level of comfort, the landscapes encountered, all of these will be very, very different depending on the mode of journey. Now let's apply this to the spiritual journey. Again, you can only start from where you are. According to Hindu teaching, every one of us is a unique individual. Every one of us is a sum total in any moment of all of our past experiences. And you might say that no two of any of us are made from the same recipe. Now, there are also different modes or methods of making this spiritual journey. And in Hinduism, we have the idea of the four yogas. One of them is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. We have Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. We have Karma Yoga, the path of selfless service. And we have Raja Yoga, the path of meditation. Now, why are there these four methods? It's because they relate to different aspects of who we are. We all think, we all feel, we all act, and we all manage our awareness in one way or another. And these four yogas address those four capacities. Those are the basic facts of life. Now, a life journey can be very pleasant, or it can be awful. It's sure to have its ups and downs. Another way in which this life journey differs from the spiritual journey is that the life journey, when we talk about journeys, we talk about development, growth, new discoveries, going to new places. The spiritual journey is essentially different from that, because the spiritual journey is a journey homeward. It's aimed at discovering our true origin, our true original being, taking us back to that source, to what we call the self, Atman or Brahman. This is the recognition of who we have always been and who we always are. Now, the universe as we know it is continually in flux. The world does not stand still. There is perpetual change. Day follows night, night follows day. We move from place to place. Everything is constantly changing. And so the idea of the spiritual journey, in one sense, is to transcend this change, to realize the changelessness of the eternal self. However, that said, I'm going to make the very paradoxical statement that the spiritual journey is all about change. Is this a paradox? It certainly seems to be. But we have to remember that the spiritual journey takes place in the context of this world, and the world is always changing. Everything around us has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so likewise, the spiritual journey is dynamic. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning of the spiritual journey is where we are at this particular moment. The middle is the incredible adventure that lies ahead. And the end, the goal, it's beyond description. Now, in life and in spiritual journeys, we all face a number of obstacles. So part of the spiritual path is about how to identify these obstacles, how to address them, and how to overcome them. And again, we are all different. Hindu teaching asserts that every one of us will reach the goal. For some of us, the path will be short and direct. For others, it may be long and winding. And it doesn't matter, because in the end, everyone will succeed. No one will be left out. Now, with a physical journey, we very often think when planning for it of all the items that we have to take along. We're going to need money, credit cards, personal care items, clothing, maybe a book to read, definitely a cell phone for most people. So we need all of this baggage to prepare for a journey. And the funny thing is that this heavy baggage, when we start out, can be very unwieldy. And the thing is, as we travel, we may pick up souvenirs, we may buy gifts for people that we're going to visit, and sometimes when we come back, we end up with more stuff than when we started out. And this is a case where there's a stark contrast between the life journey and the spiritual journey. So I just want to think you're in a hotel room in Honolulu, and it's the morning of your departure. You're going back home. And you're looking at this hula skirt. You bought it the night before at the luau. And it seemed a good thing to do in the spirit of the moment. Or maybe I should say the spirits of the moment. Maybe that third Mai Tai wasn't the best idea after all. So here you are with this hotel room looking at this hula skirt. And you're thinking, how am I going to get that home? First I'll have to pack it somehow. Then I've got to lug it to the airport. Then I've got to pay an excess baggage fee. And once I get it home, I'm going to have to find a place to store it. And what am I going to use it for? What good is it? It's just going to take up space. Space that I could be using for a better purpose. And so in this particular context, and I'm not saying anything, I'm not trashing hula skirts, but in this particular context of an image or metaphor, the hula skirt is a surprisingly good symbol for the emotional and mental baggage that we accumulate throughout life's journey. Now, the spiritual journey is an entirely different matter, and it can be summed up in 9 words. Let go of that which you do not need. This is true at every phase of the spiritual journey. It's true at the beginning, and it's true at every phase along the way. Let go of that which you do not need. Now, this is a very common message in religious teaching. We usually hear it expressed by such words as renunciation, austerity, or non-attachment. Now, those words don't always have the nicest ring to them, I have to admit that. So I'm just going to say, let's put a new spin on this whole idea and call it letting go of that which you do not need. Now, the hula skirt in this case represents that which we do not need. What should we do with it? Let it go. How do we do this? We'll begin by looking inside of ourselves. try to find all those traits, characteristics, emotions, ideas, opinions, habits that weigh us down or that hold us back. This will be very personal. No two people will have the exact same set of things that they need to let go of. But I can give some examples of very general principles. Think about it. Stress, anxiety, anger, attachment, ingratitude, a poor sense of self-image, and the awful need to be right. Each of these is an ugly, wilted, discolored blossom strung together in a poisonous garland that weighs you down. You know, what is a better thing to wear with that hula skirt than this poisonous garland? So these are negative traits. And as we find through life, through Hindu teaching, through psychology, most negative traits have roots in some skaras, impressions of past events, things that happened to us. They're still with us, lying there just below the surface. And though we're not consciously aware of them, they may color our personality, they may form our outlook, they may mold our opinions, and create patterns of behavior. And these patterns of behavior are what we know as habits. Now, habits can be good or bad, but it's the bad ones that we need to let go of. So what is letting go? Wonderful definition here. Letting go is not holding on. It's release, but it's more than release. It's also not stagnating. Letting go is moving on. And if the spiritual journey is a journey like no other, the last thing we should expect along the way is stagnation. If you're stuck in one place, it's not a journey. Now let's take a closer look at some of these negative traits, because by looking at them, maybe we can gain some insight, what they are, how they work. And we find with these negativities in our lives, very often they're related to each other, and they interact, and in doing so, they keep us bound. So, we have these ugly blossoms strung together in this poisonous garland. This is like an endless circle without apparent beginning or end, and here we are stuck. We want to break in at any place. We want to free ourselves, but instead what happens is we get involved with the events of our lives. So anytime we're touching these negativities of this garland, then we're caught up in the loop. Bhagavad Gita has some wonderful advice. In the second chapter, Sri Krishna advises Arjuna. One of my favorite passages in the whole Gita. Dwelling on the object of sense makes attachment to them grow. From attachment comes desire, and desire, thwarted, flares to anger. Anger confuses the mind, and confusion drives out mindfulness. With mindfulness gone, understanding fades, and lost understanding leads to ruin. Pretty strong stuff. Now, it begins with dwelling on the object of sense. Let's look into the very deep roots of why this happens. What is the root cause? The root cause is another memorable phrase I like to use, the smallness of you. This is the human personality, the ego sense, the feeling that I am a separate, unique individual. The ego creates a self-definition, and to define is to limit. So the moment I define myself as what I think I am, I'm also defining everything else that I am not. And what happens is I find that the what I am not is overwhelmingly larger than this what I am. And so this just calls to mind our own limitations and deficiencies. We all have separate personalities, and we all have distinct experiences of this wide world beyond the narrow borders of our own body-mind complex. And this is what Sri Krishna is talking about. There's a mechanism of the five senses. Through the five senses, we get all the information from the outer world through seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching. And so this is about dwelling on the objects of sense, as Sri Krishna said. This is part of being alive. There's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely not. What happens, though, is that sometimes we miss the whole point and we fixate on becoming happy. So we have a perception of something, and we form a mental attachment. I like that. It will make me happy. But then this attachment leads to desire. And I like that leads to I want that. What is a desire but an acknowledgement that something is missing from our lives? So then this grows and takes hold of the mind. I really want that. I need that. I've got to have it. And then this unfulfilled desire leads to failure or frustration. And here's where the downward spiral really gains momentum. Anger flares up. And when this happens, we lose our bearings. The clarity of our better judgment that we've learned through previous, sometimes painful experience gets forgotten in the heat of the moment. And then our thinking is thrown into disarray. We fly out of control. And then events fly out of control. And as Sri Krishna said, this is not going to end well. So let's begin with this idea of observation of our mental events. Part of this is what I mentioned earlier. The last of these negativities was something called the awful need to be right. This is a kind of attachment, a mental and emotional holding on to ideas that appeal to you. And again, remember, holding on is not letting go. So we become attached to our own version of the truth. We live in a world of our own making. And yes, there is a material world. We all share it. But we get all of our information in through the senses. We take it in selectively. We process it and interpret it selectively. We see things filtered by our own minds, colored by the lenses of our previous experiences, and then evaluated and judged and appropriated by the ego. And so this is where this arises, this idea of this lack of agreement with others. And when this happens, we can become annoyed, angry, argumentative, even abusively so. And as Sri Krishna said, one thing leads to another. And again, it may not end well. Now, what is the cause of all of this? It is the insecurity of the smallness of you. No matter how great you think you are, intelligent, attractive, wealthy, talented, capable, there's always virtuous. There's always going to be somebody else who outshines you. It makes you feel a little bit inferior. And so we have this idea of, I have to be right. This is my defense mechanism. There's a flip side to this defense mechanism, and that is, I am not good enough. Both of these are the ego's response to a sense of insufficiency or deficiency. One of them is, I'm better than all the rest. The other is, I'm not good enough. But in each case, this is the ego's deceptive ploy to hold on. Now, no one, least of all a spiritual aspirant, should ever think, I am not worthy. This plays into the ego's deception. So if we cling to the smallness, we fail to recognize the higher self, our own true being. If I am not good enough is our frame of reference and our starting point for what we do and think and say, where does that take us? Probably not to a very good place. So let's again recall Sri Krishna's message here. Little faults lead to large consequences. But he has a corrective. And in the verses that follow this passage, he reveals to Arjuna that the secret to avoiding this is non-attachment. Letting go of that which you do not need. We're going to speak a little more about this ego, the smallness of self, because there's a beautiful verse in the Svetashvatara Upanishad. Here, the sage, Svetashvatara, says, the individual soul should be recognized as a fraction of the 100th part of a tip of a hair, again divided 100 times. Yet it partakes of infinity. Svetashvatara is telling us about the insignificance of the individual ego self, but also he is talking about its glorious potential. This capacity to partake of infinity, to commune with the divine, to be one with the supreme reality, the supreme self. So spiritual journey is all about this. It has a very real purpose and a very real goal. It's about letting go of the smallness of you and embracing that immensity of what you truly are. The Supreme Self, the Infinite Self, the Divine. Now, when we begin the spiritual journey, a good starting place is to let go of these negative traits and habits. The starting point, of course, which probably all of us would be to let go of the obvious ones, the ones that are most noticeable. But what happens later on as you shed these bad habits, these negative traits, ways of thinking, what happens is you begin to become aware of smaller things, smaller infractions, smaller misbehaviors, things that would have been unnoticed in the past, but now suddenly they loom large before your conscience. And this can be painful, it can be disquieting. But there's also reason here to be thankful, because now you're aware of them. And once you are aware, you can work on those too, on subtler and subtler and subtler things that are keeping you in the darkness. So the other point is that letting go does not happen all at once. It is a gradual process of purification. This letting go leads to a greater understanding. And it is deeper than just relinquishing the negative habits and the thought patterns that we're so used to. Yes, we have to let those go. Recognize them and let them go. But at the same time, as you make progress, finally you're going to reach a new phase in the spiritual journey. And this is where you are going to be letting go of that which holds on. Letting go of that ego sense itself, because that is what really is the grasper. So it's all about letting go of the smallness of you. Now the immediate thing is, I'm going to lose something. I'm going to lose my identity. That's scary. But when you really stop to think about, what are you letting go of? You're letting go of an inferior, smaller identity for the sake of expanding into a larger, better sense of self. That self that partakes of infinity. And in doing so, you become an observer. Now, this is an interesting point about observing. First of all, we all experience outward events, physical objects, happenings, interactions with people, and we all experience inner feelings, emotions, moods, thoughts, and ideas. So being an observer relates to all of that. It relates to watching what's going on around you, not being affected by it. But it also relates to watching what's going on in your own mind, with your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own ideas, and not being affected by them. So what we can do is consciously try to become an impartial witness to this vast panorama of life. This spiritual discipline will ease and hasten the journey. The world will still be there with all its ups and downs, but it will no longer be able to seize you and hold you captive the way it once did. So if you can observe serenely and act wisely and without attachment, you will be freeing yourself. Now, all actions bear consequences. So we can think that at any moment we can choose to create a new course. We no longer have to wander aimlessly hither and thither or be batted around this way or that by events. We can choose our own course, one that directs us directly toward that ultimate spiritual homecoming. Now, so far we've focused a lot on these negativities of life, and they're all different. So for example, here are just some of the ways they play out with personality. We probably all know somebody who's angry, who's provoked easily, who we say has a chip on their shoulder. And this is the type of person we like to avoid. There are other people who are jealous, and that jealousy leads to resentment. Are they good company? How can you be happy with somebody who's not happy with themselves? There are other people who have this insatiable greed, and we have to be on guard, because if we have something that they want, then that puts us in a very vulnerable position. And then finally there's this awful mindset of hate. Hate is generally born of fear. And hate is very negative and can lead to the worst sorts of consequences. Now we have to ask ourselves, do we find these traits within ourselves? And I would say, for the group gathered here today, perhaps in a small degree. But we have to let go. Each spiritual journey will be unique. Each one is very personal and highly personalized. Now there's also a question that no one can avoid, and I'd like to call this the ticking clock. The world is impermanent. Everything in the world is impermanent. This is a universal fact recognized by every religion. Even the ego self is mortal. So in Hindu teaching, we're taught that life comes and goes, and we pass through one life after another until we reach enlightenment. But in the meantime, we're bound to this repeating cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth, called samsara. And the word samsara is interesting because it literally means wandering. We are all drawn on by our hopes and aspirations and driven to sidestep what we fear as we wander from one life to another. And all the while we seek satisfaction in things that do not last. Now there's a paradox here. You've probably heard this phrase, the only thing in life that is constant is change. This really is a wonderful way of expressing the paradox of impermanence in this world. And of course that impermanence can lead us to anxiety. When things are just as we like them to be, we don't want things to change. We want everything to stay just as it is, always. It makes us happy. And even the thought that things are going to change can lead to distress. People come and go from our lives. Wealth may increase. It may decrease. Comforts come and go. Our activities change over the years. The state of health may change. And finally, in the end, death robs us of those who are nearest and dearest to us. But there's nothing we can do to change the fact that life is constantly changing. Everything is impermanent. Here one moment and gone the next. Now it's interesting because the word moment carries a hint of a very powerful spiritual tool. Ask yourself, how much of the time are your thoughts caught up in time, in past, present, and future? Do you spend a lot of time thinking about the past, reminiscing about the good old days with feelings of fondness or maybe nostalgia? Or maybe, on a darker note, you're mourning what has passed, people that have been lost, situations that are gone. Or maybe you attach your mind to unpleasant or painful memories. And of course this leads to resentment. This seeps into the present. Maybe you think of past mistakes and dwell on them with regret or guilt. And then this regret and this guilt become your unwanted companions in your daily life. Why let the past ruin the present? Or, in the other direction, maybe you spend a lot of time anticipating the future. Do you do so with hope or with dread? Hope that things will get better or that they'll stay good? Or maybe the dread that there will be loss and pain lying ahead? How much of your mental activity is taken up with a past that is no more, or a future that may never be? If so, you're missing out on the present, and you're failing to recognize a moment of choice and opportunity. And in spiritual life, every moment should be a moment of choice and opportunity. We can go even deeper with this idea of moment, and we can think of the moment as the eternal now. In this fullest sense, living in the moment disengages the mind from this play of time and space, of happiness and misery and everything that's going on. So the spiritual journey is all about leaving all that behind, and we do so in the moment. Now, what is to be left behind most of all? Interestingly, it is the ever-changing sense of who or what we think we are. This troublesome smallness of you, this ego self. We are, in fact, the higher self. Call it Atman, Brahman, or God. And that is a changeless truth that abides in the moment. The Shvetashvatara Upanishad, again, speaking of the infinitesimally small self, partaking of infinity. So one who partakes of infinity becomes the imperturbable witness of all things. And the Hindu teaching on witness consciousness is very interesting. Here's one example. There was, about 1,000 years ago, a great poet who lived in Kashmir named Abhinavagupta, and he was a non-dual Shaivite philosopher and realized soul. And he addressed the universal problems of life in the 11th verse of his poem, 12 verses on the highest truth, Paramartha Dwadashika. Now notice as I read the text of this verse, it's a long, complicated verse, but notice how it weaves together the themes of time and change, the pains inflicted by the clashing of human egos, the internal misery that the ego creates for itself, the insubstantial nature of personal identity, and finally, the state of being a witness. Here's Abhinavagupta's verse. Let accumulating time drive the moments onward. Let the Creator assiduously create, or let a passion compelled by another lead to sore distress. Let these come about through the external sound and fury of the cosmic play, or through the internal doings of the embodied soul, whose ongoing flow of ever-shifting self-definition seems as if founded on air. In this constantly changing grand delusion, am I not a spectator? Notice here the serenity of the witness consciousness. Be mindful that the reactions all stem from the ego self. Abhinavagupta defines the ego in a way spoken from his own experience as a realized soul. And with his full measure of his poetic genius, he defines it as an ongoing flow of ever-shifting self-definition. The sense of personal identity rests on nothing more than air. Now observe how we think of ourselves. Just look at an ordinary day. How do you think of yourself? First of all, everything changes from one moment to the next. We all fulfill a number of roles in life. You may be a parent, a spouse, an employee, an employer, a teacher, a student, a friend. Do you feel like you are the exact same person in every one of these situations? Which one is the real you? And then, when things are all going well, we have a warm sense maybe of satisfaction, of joy, of self-worth. But then any unpleasantness, even an unkind word or a dirty look, just can banish that sense of well-being in an instant. And instead, you are suddenly confronting anger, fear, doubt, or inadequacy. Again, you have to ask yourself, which is the real me? The miserable one now or the happy one a moment ago? Abhinavagupta understood that the I who I think I am is as if founded on air. And this phrase expresses just how fragile and insubstantial the sense of personal identity can be. The spiritual journey is about leaving behind the smallness of you, always susceptible to these outside influences. We have to leave that behind. This will lead us to embrace the unchanging nature of the higher self, the Atman, the witness, or as Abhinavagupta calls it, the spectator. So far, we've been thinking about the unwanted baggage we're accumulating and dragging along through this journey of life. And the idea that there's, in the spiritual journey, the need to discard the negative baggage. At any point in the spiritual journey, we can and must embrace the positive. And this leads to another travel metaphor, food. Now just imagine you've been traveling, you arrive in Sweden, you're in Stockholm, and you're taken to a smorgasbord. It all looks so inviting and delectable. There's so much to choose from. There are aspects of the spiritual journey that can be just as appealing. The beauty is we have choices. Some are better than others. They differ in various ways. For example, at the smorgasbord, let's imagine you're there looking at the first course, and you really don't like fish, but you notice there are a number of different herring preparations. Don't despair, because there are plenty of other dishes to choose from as well. There's something here to please every palate. And so the spiritual life lays out before us an array of possibilities. So let's sample a few of them. How about let's start with a starter course. What's a good starter course? Right action. Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra has this as his beginning of spiritual life. He has the 8-limbed yoga, and the first of the 8 limbs is what is called yama, restraint. Yama consists of 5 different parts: doing no harm to others, being truthful, not stealing, observing sexual propriety, and refraining from greed. Now, this is a very good way to begin our spiritual life, because what it does, it establishes a harmonious relationship with the world around us. If there is no peace without, how can there be peace within? Furthermore, these 5 principles of yama are universally found in all the world's religions, and these 5 actually correspond very closely to the latter 5 of the Judeo-Christian 10 Commandments. Another good starter course might be the company we keep. The spiritual journey is a journey of self-transformation, and so the company that we keep should be understanding, supportive, maybe even sharing our aspirations. Maybe some of the people that we already know and associate with closely have had a glimpse of what lies ahead. So these kinds of associations create a shared purpose, and they encourage us to keep our sights on the goal, the sense of community. Now, in the Hindu tradition, there's a very special association, and that is the relationship of the spiritual aspirant and the guru. In the Upanishads, we have many stories of seekers turning to guidance to a holy person. And why do they do that? It's because they know that the guru has already been there. Let's compare this to making your way through a dense forest. Let's say that this part of the journey of life goes through a dense forest, and here you are. Do you want to try it on your own to sort of tumble through this thing, not knowing what you're doing, where you're going? Or do you want the company of somebody who knows the way, who's already been there, who knows the pitfalls, who knows the obstacles, who knows the wrong turns? I think the answer there would be pretty obvious. Also, there's this idea in the Hindu tradition that this transmission of spiritual knowledge is very personal. We just have to look again back thousands of years to the teachings of the Upanishads, and we see that the knowledge is transmitted privately from one individual, the guru, the enlightened soul, to the seeker. Now, there are other forms of spiritual study and spiritual knowledge, of course. But it's quite another thing to know that what you're receiving personally from the guru has been passed along in that way, generation after generation, for thousands of years. Make no mistake, there is power in that flow. Now, we've finished our appetizers, and now we're ready for the main course. And again, there's a wide array of main courses before us. And of course, main courses are made of many different ingredients. But there is one ingredient that is essential to all of them, and we will call that looking inward. So we want something that is going to teach us how to look inward. And there are different ways of looking inward as well. One of the forms of looking inward would be prayer. Another is contemplation. There's meditation. And there's silence. Now, prayer. What is prayer? We think of prayer as talking to God. Prayer directs us inward, and it forms a bridge to the divine, who rests at the very heart of our being. But you know what? Just like in the ordinary world, in day-to-day life, there are some people who talk too much. Chatterboxes. They just never shut up. We might do that during prayer. Now, prayer should not be one-sided, because it is a conversation. We should not do all the talking. We can say what we need to say, fine. But if we just keep on and on and on, that's not prayer. That's monologue. So, prayer engages us in a relationship with the divine, with God, whoever or whatever he, she, or it is. And in this relationship, there is give and take. Once we've had our say, then it's time to shut up. This is from personal experience. We have to listen. In order to hear that inner voice speak, there must be silence. Such silence is more than the absence of sound. Mental silence is something palpable in which the divine presence makes itself known. You'll know it when it happens. Now, the Brahma Sutra commentary by Shankara recalls an incident from a lost Upanishad. And Swami Prabhupada, my guru, used to love to quote this. I don't know how many times I heard him tell this story. But according to this lost Upanishad, there was a disciple named Badwa who went to see a guru named Bashkali, and he questioned the guru all about the nature of Brahman. And after he had had his say, the teacher was quiet. And so the disciple asked again. And again, the teacher didn't say anything. So the disciple asked his question a third time over. And at that point, Bashkali replied, "I've already told you, but you do not understand. The self is silence." The self is also love. In the Christian New Testament, in the first epistle of John, we read this verse, "He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love." Now, before you dismiss this as feel-good rhetoric or sentimental claptrap, be aware that the larger context here is knowledge. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. This biblical verse is about knowing the nature of the divine as love. And of course, in Vedantic teaching, we have the same principle. Knowing the nature of the self is recognizing it as divine. Recognizing that our own higher self is divine. It is Satchit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. The Ananda part of it, the bliss, that is love. And it is a love that we cannot even imagine. Yet it lies at the core of who we are, at the very core of our being. And as we progress in our spiritual journey, this love will become more and more evident in the way we think and feel and speak and act. We will find eventually that we love to love. We become that saturated in love. We become that saturated in God. Now when that happens, that love can only overflow. It has no place else to go other than to flow out into the world around us. And so we find that this love brings us into connection with our fellow human beings. But before you can love others, you have to love yourself. And what is that self-love? We've spoken before about the ego self, based on this idea of the smallness of you. Loving yourself is shedding any feelings of unworthiness, ceasing to think that I am not good enough. Loving yourself is taking down that wall of separation that is I, me, and mine. That separates you from the world. It separates you from other people. Loving yourself is about letting go of that smallness of you, letting go of that ego sense. And then when you connect through silence with the God within, you connect with your own higher self, whose nature is love. And then what happens is very interesting, because this kind of love is utterly selfless. And it leads to a life of compassion and service. In the Vedantic tradition, we have the idea of karma yoga, worshiping God through service to your fellow human beings. I used to be involved with an organization that distributed meals to the homeless on the streets. And very often we would have somebody new on the team who was along for the first time. And I used to tell them a mantra for serving. It's not about me. Any act of true service, of true love, is utterly selfless. It's all about the other. And this leads to a connection with the other. Now, karma yoga is a very powerful spiritual path. Like all other spiritual paths, it is a means to letting go of the ego. And this service, truly performed in the right spirit, again, is a means to letting go of the ego. Now that we've sampled the variety and richness of the spiritual smorgasbord, yes, we're still in Stockholm, let's have dessert. I can think of no better dessert than simplicity. Keeping it simple is a principle so obvious that we fail to notice it. And throughout the millennia, we've had philosophers, theologians, men and women alike, who have spent untold time and energy trying to figure out the meaning of life. What is it? And the more they think about it, and the more complicated the theories are that they devise. And the more they talk about them, the more confusion arises. And then it's back and forth and disputes and on and on. There's a beautiful spiritual teaching I read once, or actually heard. Why waste all that time and energy tying the mind into knots? Or, to put it another way, why waste all that time and energy constructing long sentences between you and the silence? Now, in the Upanishads, we find that God is the Supreme Self. God is one without a second. What can be simpler than that? It is a simplicity beyond all thought. It takes us beyond the mind, beyond our perceptions, beyond our conceptions, beyond what we think, beyond mental activity. God is one without a second. There is no other. And if God is this ultimate simplicity, then the closer we come to God, the simpler things should become. I can remember a personal incident many, many years ago, almost 50 years ago, in fact. I was in the green room of the here on this property. On a Wednesday night, Swami Prabhavanand and Christopher Isherwood were there. Chris had read from the Gospel. He had finished the reading, and people were asking questions. I was on the floor. Most of the people were on the living room floor. We didn't have too many chairs in those days. Swami was in one of the big overstuffed chairs on one side of the fireplace. Chris was on the one on the other side. And a woman asked Swami a question. She had some really complex, awful problem going on in her life, and she really didn't know what to do. And so she asked the question, and he looked at her, and he came out with an answer that was absolutely simple. It just cut right to the heart of the matter, made it absolutely, perfectly crystal clear what was to be done and how easy it was to do. And in that moment, I looked at Swami in his just radiant face, and I was recalled all those stories about Holy Mother, when she used to have people come to her, again, with these terrible problems, and she would just cut right through them to the heart, to the simplicity of all of it, and tell them what to do. And I just thought, here we are in this room with Swami. He learned this from Holy Mother. He had several occasions in his life when he took the dust of her feet. One time she even invited him to her home and she fed him like a mother would feed her child. And so this idea of spiritual teaching being passed along from generation to generation, and the power and the beauty that is there, that was one of those moments illustrating this right here at this very Vedanta Society in the living room of the greenhouse. So the whole idea is simplicity. If God is the ultimate simplicity, then the closer we come to God, the simpler everything should become. As we approach the simplicity, all confusion vanishes. We awaken to the inner light. We recognize our own perfection, and we become one with the divine reality. We recognize it. We become one with that which we have always been, that we always are. And so this is the end of this journey like no other. And this journey like no other, it turns out, proves to be our true homecoming. Om Advam Jwalati Jyotirahmasmi Jyotir Jwalati Brahmahamasmi Yohamasmi Brahmahamasmi Ahamasmi Brahmahamasmi Ahamevahamam Juhomi Swaha. The light within me shines. I am the light. The light that shines brightly. I am that Brahman. I am that. That which I am is nothing but Brahman. I am, and I am Brahman. I myself offer myself into the infinite light, which is myself. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace.